Hello, everybody, and you're very welcome to tonight's talk, which is being held by the Friends of the International Brigades in Ireland with the cooperation of the East Wall History Group. The East Wall History Group is, as some of you may know, a local community history group based in the Dublin Docklands area. In relation to the Spanish Civil War, we are quite proud of the International Brigadier Jack Nalty, who was a resident here for most of his life and was a trade union organiser in Dublin Port. Our area also has connections with Dinny Cody, whose family still live in the area in Caledon Road and are well known locally. And from the North Wall area also came Bill Gannon, who was one of the main organisers of the men into the brigades in Ireland, and of course Sean O'Casey, who is associated with this community quite strongly. He lived in the area for many years. He was a very outspoken supporter of the Spanish Republic. So this is a heritage that we in the East Wall community are very proud of. Today, we're going to celebrate some of that. So our first speaker after I've spoken will be Garage, who is going to introduce today's presentation on behalf of Phoebe, and then Paul O'Brien will speak. And Paul O'Brien, who's an activist and writer, he has recently completed a political biography of Sean O'Casey, and he was a special guest at last year's annual Sean O'Casey Festival here in East Wall, where he spoke on that subject. So tonight, Paul will be discussing how Irish literary figures responded to the events of the Spanish Civil War. So before Paul begins his presentation, I'd like to pass over to Garage, who will introduce tonight's event on behalf of Phoebe.
Hi, Gurmagat, and Falcherov, like Higginokai Special to Shaw, National Brigade International Comaru. Hi, I'm Garage O'Mackle. I'm the PRO with Friends of the International Brigades in Ireland, and we're delighted to team up with the East Wall History Group on the auspicious occasion of this online Charlie Donnelly Winter School. The Charlie Donnelly Winter School was inaugurated some years back by the Friends of Charlie Donnelly, a group that later evolved into Friends of the International Brigades as the scope of their commemorative work to honour the brigaders from all over Ireland, spread across the country, out from the commemorations of Charlie Donnelly alone, to commemorate all our international brigaders from whatever county they came, or indeed from their adopted countries around the world. So we're a busy organisation, Phoebe. It is our intention to honour every single brigadier from Ireland with a plaque or our traditional cairn, our stone monuments that we build around the country. We have several more scheduled. We had quite a few scheduled for last year. Circumstances, of course, did not allow us to get on with our building development programme for new memorials to brigaders. But we have several lined up as soon as we're allowed back out onto the road. Plans are afoot, sites have been identified, the materials have been purchased, and we're ready to go with a ferocious building campaign of monuments around the country. Now, this time of the year is quite sad for people in Phoebe, because normally we would be with our comrades in Madrid to commemorate the Battle of Jarama. And indeed, we will this weekend commemorate Charlie Donnelly, who died on the 27th of February. So this Saturday, we will have a wreath-laying ceremony led by Phoebe, but involving other groups and participants, socially distanced, and we shall record it live on Facebook and get it up here for you. As I said, normally we'd be just coming back from Madrid, where we take part in the Jarama commemorative march with comrades from all around the world to honour those brave women and men who went to defend democracy and freedom in Spain. Hopefully next year's Charlie Donnelly Winter School will be based back on the Hill of the O'Neill in Dungannon at the top of the square, where we held our last very successful school 2 years ago. And we hope to relaunch our essay competition as part of that for schools across the country. And the lucky winners of that competition come to Harama with us in February and join in all of the commemorative events there. So a big shout out to Abby and our friends in Rivas, Batia, Madrid, a council overlooking area overlooking the Harama Valley, where there is a beautiful monument to Charlie Donnelly, built with 32 stone from all counties in Ireland. It was built in 2010, and we so much look forward to getting back there. However, back to our friends in the East Wall. Thanks ever so much to Joe and Katrina and Paul for organising this event this evening, and I hope you enjoy the fantastic talk. I'm really looking forward to it. And we'll see you all on the other side. No pasaran.
Thank you very much, Garoj, for that. Just before Paul begins, can I just ask people to make sure that their microphone is muted so that the sound is nice and clear, and then afterwards, then we'll unmute people so that you can ask questions. So if you could just double check that your microphone is muted. I'll actually click on mute all. And then I'll unmute you, Paul. Okay, Paul, we should be ready for you to go now. If you are ready.
Yeah, right, thank you. There are many fine writers from an Irish perspective about the history of the Irish Civil War, beginning with Michael O'Riordan's book Connolly Column from 1979. But what I want to talk about tonight is the literary and artistic response of Irish writers at the time of the Civil War. I mean, the 1930s was a time of immense political upheaval. You had the follow-on of the economic crash of 1929, the rise of fascism across Europe, and the threat of war. And this sense of prevailing disaster seemed to be realized by the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, which in the opinion of many, that the options that was facing humanity was socialism or barbarism. The British poet Stephen Spender described the period around the mid-1930s as a rush to the barricades and the printing presses. And this sense of commitment by writers and artists was best summed up, I think, by George Orwell, who himself went to fight in Spain. He said the reason he went there was because if fascism wins, I'm finished as a writer. And Tom O'Brien, a young Irish writer and revolutionary, who went to Spain in 1938, wrote, he was a poet, and he said, I've written poems in words, now I shall write one in action. And the crisis of the 1930s dissolved the division between literature and politics. And in this atmosphere, Spain was a mobilizing event for Irish writers and artists. British socialist publications such as the Left Book Club, the Left Review, which you can see there. As you can see, if you look at it there, poems by Lorca, thing on Dickens, a play On Guard for Spain, circulated in Ireland. And I think these inspired writers to be more engaged with political and social issues. And out of this milieu came the Unity Club. The Unity Club was on the corner of O'Connell Street and Sackville Street. And if you look, sometimes if you're going by O'Connell Street in that corner, if you look up, you'll see a little plaque on it saying Unity Building. And that was the organizing center in the 1930s for many left-wing and cultural events in Dublin. And out of that milieu came the New Theatre Group in Dublin and the Left Book Club Theatre Group in Belfast, which I'll talk about later. Now, in a literary sense, the first to respond to the events in the Civil War was Peadar O'Donnell and Owen Sheehy Skeffington. O'Donnell went to Spain in early 1936 to find some space and quiet to write a novel, which he said was crumbling in his brain. But within months, the Spanish Civil War broke out, the novel was thrown aside, and he makes notes of the conversations and debates that are taking place in the village where he is staying. He first published an article in the Ireland Today magazine in September 1936. You can see it there, What I Saw in Spain. And really that article, with a few other pieces, was the genesis for his book, Salou, An Irishman in Spain, which was published in London in 1937. Now the book is hastily composed, and there's no doubt it's uneven and episodic. But what it manages in a wonderfully literary way is to capture the sense of, the heat and dust at the time, the endless debates in the cafes, the fervor of political debate, and decisions had to be made on what side people were going to fall on as the Civil War opened up. And there are wonderful descriptions in it that catches this sense of tension that's in the air in Spain. The pride of a father as he watches his son march off to join the militia. Now, Salou is not a history of the war in any sense. It was written to influence attitudes in Britain and Ireland. And if you look at, though it's not a history, there are 2 chapters in it that analyze the political complexities within the Republican Army that are, I think, without equal in terms of their objectivity and logical treatment. So he wrote the book really as a polemic to dispel the image of the war in Spain as a contest between Christianity and a godless communism. He was also the first to recognize, as the years went by, as the war progressed, that Franco was winning the war. And he was very reluctant, and he argued with comrades in Ireland that we shouldn't be sending men out to fight for a cause that was already lost, that the comrades should stay at home in Ireland and fight for a workers' republic here. And after his return to Ireland in 1937, he describes the anti-communist and pro-Franco hysteria that had gripped the country. This is a meeting advertised for the Irish Christian Front in Rathmines Town Hall in November 1936 in support of Franco. Nice little thing down there at the bottom. Show by your presence at this meeting that Ireland rejects communism. This is a group of the Christian Front at a meeting in Howth in the same year. And these rallies that were held by the Irish Christian Front, supported by the church, were attracting huge numbers. At one of the rallies, 50,000 attended to it. Another rally, they had trains coming from all over the country to attend the rally in Dublin. But what's also, I think, nice in the book, despite describing the anti-Christian front, he describes, or he prints a sort of an anti-O'Duffy, an anti-Franco ballad by Shirley McAllister, which is rather amusing. If you look at there, the second verse, I particularly like the chorus. With the gold supplied by Vickers, I can buy blue shirt and knickers. Let the Barcelona Bolsheviks take a warning, for I lately took the notion to cross the briny ocean, and I start for Salamanca in the morning. So McAllister wrote a whole series of these satirical songs about O'Duffy and the blue shirts and the Irish Christian Front. And he published one about every 2 or 3 weeks. And they had a great impact around Ireland, and particularly around Dublin at the time. Now, the O'Donnell book, it didn't sell greatly at the time, but and then disappeared for years. But I'm glad to say that it was reissued last year in a new edition, a very fine edition, and it's available from the organisers of this meeting and from any good bookshop across the country. It was also translated into Spanish, so the, it goes beyond Ireland. And I think one of the interesting things about the book is that it was reviewed by an Irish poet, Leslie Daiken, in LEFTREVIEW, which I spoke about earlier. That was a left-wing British literary journal that was published by members of the Communist Party and those fellow travelers of the Communist Party in the 1930s. And this was published in June 1937. And this is a very unfavorable review by Leslie Daiken. And if you look at the title, Backward to Liberalism, I mean, even the very title gives you an indication of what the review was going to be about. And I think that Backward to Liberalism also had a real barb in it, in the sense that just shortly before that, the Left Book Club in Britain had published a book by Stephen Spender, who had joined the Communist Party at that stage, inspired by the events in Spain. And that was titled Forward from Liberalism. So you can see how cutting a remark in terms of the review that the title he chose for his review. Back home in Ireland, the magazine, very interesting magazine that was published in the 1930s, first edition was June 1936, just a month before the Spanish Civil War broke out. And it was one of the few mainstream publications to put politics at the center of its editorial policy. In September 1936, a few months later, it published this edition, a special edition called A Symposium on Spain. It was edited by Owen Sheehy Skeffington, who was the son of Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and Frank Sheehy Skeffington, who was murdered during the 1916 Rising. And every month, Skeffington wrote the foreign commentary for Ireland Today. But within the magazine, as the Spain developed and as the backlash against the Republican government arose in Ireland, there was a tension between those on the editorial board who wanted a more mainstream editorial policy and the left wing and Republicans such as Sheehy Skeffington, who wanted to tell the truth about what was going on in Spain. And this tension came to a head over when the church criticized the special issue containing the symposium on Spain. And the editor, fearing a public backlash, asked Sheehy Skeffington in the future to tone down his support for the Republicans in Spain. But he wasn't prepared to do that, and he was asked to resign from the magazine. And even that could not save it. Church opposition over the following 2 years made it difficult to sustain, and Ireland Today folded in 1938, which was a great loss at the period. Now, despite all the articles and polemics that, by the way, that's just one of Sheehy Skeffington's editorials on Spain. This was his very first one on the origin of the Civil War in Spain. And every month he went through the arguments about what was happening in Spain and how it affected the issue in Ireland. But just to say this, despite all these articles and polemics, I think if you look back at the period of 1936 to 1939 during the Spanish Civil War, without doubt, it was the poets who caught the public imagination. Because what the poets did was they built a bridge through images out to the general public. And sometimes this bridge provides a very romantic view of the great events in Spain. W.H. Auden, the British poet, described the period as a decade where poets exploded like bombs. And that's very true. Irish poets are very well represented in the various anthologies of poetry of the Spanish Civil War, and there are 4 or 5 of them knocking about that have been published since those great events. But this book, Poems from Spain, only publishes poems by poets who had actually participated in the fighting. So it doesn't publish, for instance, people like Spender people like W.H. Auden, who went out to Spain, or Hemingway, who were observers really of the war, but not actual participants in it. And of the poets that are represented as the fighters, if you like, who are also poets in this thing, Ireland is very well represented. There's the work of Jim Haughey. Jim Haughey is from County Armagh. He was a poet. He after the Spanish Civil War was over and World War II broke out, he signed up for the Air Force in Britain to continue, in his view, the fight against fascism. And he died, I think it was 1941, during one of the battles. Also, Pat O'Reilly, another man who went out to fight, a minor poet, who I suppose is best known because he met and married out there Saleria Leah, an Afro-American nurse who had volunteered and gone out to support the Republican government in Spain. There was also Joe Monks in this edition, in the Jim Jump edition, who went on to write in 1985 with the Reds in Andalusia. And that's available for online. If you just put in Joe Monks, you'll find it there. Tom O'Brien, that's him in uniform there on the left, and I'll talk about him later. He wrote this poem. He was a poet and a playwright. He wrote this poem called Marching. And if you just the first couple of lines there, now is there an hour when workers are not on the march somewhere in the world in unified ranks for a dead or suffering comrade. And you can see that poems like this and many of the poems in that anthology that I talked about are propagandistic, they're partisan, they're written to inspire people into action. And in that sense, they are important historical documents. But outside the confines of history, I'm not sure that they have a great deal of literary merit. And certainly within the academy, such writers tend to be very much ignored today. Now, the 1930s was also a difficult time for socialists and Republicans in Dublin. And many of them, to escape unemployment and repression, moved over to London. And while they were in London, they were based around the Irish Front. This is a little Gestetnerd magazine that they had that came out monthly. The Irish Front was the London base of the Republican clubs in London. And around, we had Charlie Donnelly, Daiken, this poet, Ewart Milne, very fine woodcut by the the Jewish socialist, Harry Kernoff, who did that. While Ewart Milne was there, he became part of the Spanish Medical Aid Committee, and he actually went out and served as a medic in Spain. And he wrote a number of articles for Ireland Today and a number of other magazines, and they've been drawn together in book form called Drums Without End: Stories of the Spanish Civil War. This is a photograph. He's there second from the right, with three other comrades from the Medical Aid for Spain group. And also associated in London with the Irish Front group was Leslie Daiken. Leslie Daiken there, you can see he's the second from the right, the guy in the glasses beside the woman. He was part of the Irish Front, and he wrote that review of the O'Donnell book that I talked about. And in 1936, he put together a collection of poems called Goodbye Twilight. 40 Irish poets were represented into it. And Goodbye Twilight was a break with the Celtic twilight poetry of Yeats and the literary revival of the past decades. And what they described as the new poetry. They tried to change the patterns of injustice by influencing people's actions rather than their emotions. And that was also a feature, of course, of much of the Spanish Civil War poetry of the late 1930s. And so if you look at Goodbye Twilight, this is the voice of the worker, the small farmer, the peasant, articulating their right to justice, and above all else, security in their daily life. This is a poem by Daiken that he wrote about the death of his comrade and friend, Charlie Donnelly, who we've already spoken about, and his belief that his sacrifice would be vindicated. And now, in the name of the militant millions here and there, in the name of Pearson Conley and Cornford, Lorca and Charlie Donnelly, dead singers of red poems everywhere, we do not despair. And I think it's important to say this. For Daiken and many others, poems such as this did not signify the last great cause, merely a setback on the road to progress in the future. And while there are many fine poets in the collection, the majority have not survived at all and probably don't deserve to do so. The exception, I think, is Charlie Donnelly. He was born 1914 in Tyrone. He was in UCD in the 1930s, a member of the left-wing student vanguard group, and he was active in the slum clearing campaign, for which he was jailed in 1934. And after his release, he moved to London and he became part of the Irish Front Group. He also contributed a number of poems to Ireland Today and to Left Review. He went to Spain in January 1937 and joined the Irish contingent led by Frank Rhine. And as been said, he was killed at the Battle of Jarama on 27th of February 1937 at the age of 22. And a comrade remembers him picking up a bunch of olives during a lull in the battle and saying, "Even the olives are bleeding," and which is sort of a saying that came to summarize for many the despair at the fascist victory in Spain. His small body of work, I think, is a real testament to his potential. His tight, modernist poetry managed to bridge the gap between responsibility towards society and responsibility towards poetic form. And this is what makes his poetry stand out from much of the stuff from the 1930s. His poetry is a fusion of the personal and the political. George Gilmore, who was a founder member of the Republican Congress, described a letter he received from London from Charlie Donnelly, where he wrote about uniting politics and poetry. Donnelly said he was reading Shelley in the political context and James Connolly in the literary one. And I think that's a wonderful description of how, political poetry should actually be written. And in those few months before Charlie Donnelly died, he wrote much of his best work. This is just simply entitled Poem, which was published in Ireland Today, the month before he died, January 1937. And I'll just read a few lines there from the second verse. Your flag is public over granite, gulls fly above it. Whatever the issue of the battle is, your memory is public. For all of them to pull awry with crooked hands, moist eyes, and village reputations will be built on inaccurate accounts of your campaign. Your name for orators, figure stone stuck beneath damp Dublin sky. His most famous poem from that period is Tolerance of Crows, which was published in the month that he died in Ireland Today, February 1937. Death comes in quantity from solved problems on maps, well-ordered dispositions, angles of elevation and direction. And his work, small as it is, can stand comparison with the best of that decade. And his work disappeared for many years after his death. Most people suspect it was family opposition for religious and political reasons. And really, he didn't emerge as his poetry really didn't come before the public until this edition of Charlie Donnelly by his brother Joseph was published in 1987. And then another edition. Oh, sorry, something's happened here. Yeah, sorry about that. And then we had another edition in 2012, Heroic Heart, a Charlie Donnelly Charles Donnelly reader. And I think this has been an important book in bringing his work and his life to public attention once more. And obviously, it'll be discussed over many years in the Charlie Donnelly Annual School. Also of interest is the Joseph O'Connor book, Even the Olives Are Bleeding, which is a short biography written in 1992. Donnelly's monument in Spain, just south of Madrid, just a short space from where he died in 1937. Now, in addition to the writers who went to Spain, there were many on the home front who helped to tell the truth about what was going on in Spain. Sean Murray in The Worker, the paper of the Irish Communist Party, wrote regular articles bringing the issue to the attention of the public. The Spanish Aid Committee in Dublin included writers such as Owen Sheehy Skeffington and Dorothy McCardle, and they exposed the claim that the war in Spain was about religion. And of course, in addition to raising money for the Republican side. This is a leaflet put out at the time called Food Ship for Spain Committee. And if you look closely at it, you'll see the address they're using is 14 Sackville Place, Dublin. That's the Unity Club that I spoke about earlier. Also important was the Irish diaspora in England, particularly those based in London. The Left Review published a book called Authors Take Sides on the Spanish Civil War, in which they wrote to over 150 writers, asking them to give their view on who they supported in the Civil War. Of the 148 contributions they got back, it was overwhelmingly in favor of the Republican side. There were only 6 or 7 who supported Franco or were neutral on it. Irish writers who responded to this very favorably was Bernard Shaw, Liam O'Flaherty, Louis MacNeice, Sean O'Casey, James Stephens. And in an odd way, all of those would write a paragraph, maybe 10 or 15 lines, outlining the reason why they supported the Spanish Republic government. But despite all those famous people, the one that everyone remembers from this particular booklet was the one that Samuel Beckett sent back. He sent back this, just a single word, "Up the Republic." Very Beckett in terms of what he was to do later. Sean O'Casey was very active in support of the Republicans in Spain. There's this discussion or meeting that was put on in the Royal Albert Hall, so whole 6,000 people. So you can imagine, what a big issue this was in June 1937. Speakers were Picasso, Heinrich Mann, and there were also messages broadcast direct to the meeting from Paul Robeson and Pablo Casals. And if you look down very closely, supported of the 20 or so, the great and the good is included is the name of Sean O'Casey. And he refers to the events in Spain in 2 of the plays that he wrote a little after the Spanish Civil War ended. The Star Turns Red, which he wrote in 1939, and Oak Leaves and Lavender, which he wrote in 1946. And in addition to events like this, this little magazine, Spanish News, actually it's a little 4-page newspaper. Spanish News also circulated in Ireland. And if you look down at the bottom, you'll see what Frank Ryan means to Ireland in the February 37 issue, written by Jack Kearney. Jack Kearney was a very close friend of Sean O'Casey, and in the archives there are hundreds of letters between Jack Kearney and Sean O'Casey. And the reason Jack Kearney was in London and writing for this paper was that because James Larkin had refused to give public support to the Republican movement in Spain and banned the officials from speaking out in favour of it. Kearney was an official in the Workers' Union of Ireland, and over the issuance of Spain, he resigned from the union and went to work in London as a journalist. This is from the Left Book Club. And this gives you a flavour of the sort of things that were going on. The Left Book Club were offering to give money for every member who signed up. And they had over 500 members in Ireland. I'm coming towards the end now, but before I finish, I want to just say a few words about theatre, which also played a role in publicising the events in Spain. Left-wing theatre groups, such as the New Theatre Group in Dublin, the Left Book Club theatre group in Belfast, put on films and poetry and plays in support of Spain. You'll see there Jack Lindsay's On Guard for Spain, which the Belfast group put on to raise money for Spain. They also showed the newsreel in their theatre, The Defence of Madrid, and over 1,000 people came to see the various showings of that film. They also put on a Spanish night and a speaker from the International Brigades in November 1938, both to raise money and to explain the issues to the people of Belfast. The Belfast Left Book Club, another group that contained people like John Hewitt, the poet John Hewitt, the writer Sam Hannah Bell. You can see in this leaflet they put out, the Belfast Left Book Club discussion group. Halfway down, they say the Arms for Spain committee meeting. They are holding a public meeting on the Customs House to raise money to buy arms for Spain. And so these are the sort of events that writers and artists were involved in Ireland, trying to raise the issue and raise money for what was going on in Spain. And the New Theatre Group in Dublin were also active in raising money and awareness as well. Tom O'Brien, who I spoke about earlier, returned to Dublin after the International Brigades were disbanded in late 1938. And he wrote a play called The Last Hill. It's a play that's written in verse, and it's set in Catalonia as the remnants of the Republican forces hold out against the fascists. The first character, Jose, this is the last hill of Catalonia, and this is the last gun to stammer out resistance. Miguel, this gun will rip hot lead around the world. Hear it. This is just a symbol, striking rock and earth, killing nothing but a fascist hope to rule a world of men who won't be slaves. So that was put on by the New Theatre Group, and I believe it also played in the Abbey a little bit later. This book, Strong Words, Brave Deeds, is the poetry, life and times of Thomas O'Brien. And certainly for anyone who's interested in the 1930s and Thomas O'Brien, it's really worth a read. It contains all his poems, his plays, and there are also essays from various people about it. You'll notice there at the bottom on the left-hand side, you'll see it was published by the O'Brien Press, which of course Tom O'Brien himself actually founded. Right, I'll sum up to conclude. Great claims were made in the 1930s for poets as a social force. And as somebody wrote, Franco may have won the war, but the left won the literary battle. And that's true. I mean, even though I've said not a great deal survives in terms of literature from the left from the 1930s, nothing survives from the Franco and the O'Duffy forces from that particular period. But I think it's important to say this. Many poets and writers died on the front, but this can sometimes diminish the contribution of the tens of thousands of working class men and women who fought and died there. As I said, little remains of that progressive literary and artistic movements from that time. And not all of it was good, though all of it, I believe, was very sincere, and certainly some of it deserves to be remembered. Thank you. Sin Will.
Gurmila Mahigat, Paul. So thank you, Paul, for what I'm sure everybody will agree was a very rich insight into the literary and cultural heritage surrounding the Spanish Civil War and the impact of that here on the island of Ireland. So thanks again. I suppose we'll open it up to the floor now, and as usual, if you want to make a comment or ask a question, if you could raise your hand, and we'll then call you out and ask you to unmute yourself, and you can ask your questions. If you want to stop sharing your screen there, Paul, so we can get a nice visual of you of you answering questions. Sorry. So if anybody has a question, please raise your hand, or if you don't want to ask it out loud, you can always put it into the chat box, which my friend and colleague, Joe, will be monitoring, I think. Okay, so just raise your hand if you have a question. People can put their videos on now if they want to as well. Oh, sorry, Garage, have you a question there if you want to unmute yourself?
Karina, it's Joe here. Just
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether people are
Able to
unmuted, but there's a question here. I'm looking at the chat box, so I know I'm coming up as Mary Dunn. My apologies. It is me. From Emmett O'Connor, this question is: were there different political currents among the different writers? And then Paul, you'll need to unmute yourself to answer that. Sorry. Were there different political currents among the writers?
It's in the bottom left.
Right, yeah, gotcha. Are you talking about, I presume you're talking about Irish writers? Yes, there was. I mean, one of the interesting things was really the two traditions that many of these came from. There was both the Republican tradition and the, if you like, the Communist Party tradition or the Socialist tradition. And I mean, so both currents provided people for the International Brigades in Spain. Unfortunately, some of the writers, like Ewart Milne, he reneged on his socialist ideals in the aftermath of the war, given his experience of what happened in Spain. Both Milne and Charlie Donnelly as well were critical of the role of the Communist, not the Irish Communist Party, but the Communist Party in Spain, direction that it took. So how much it influenced their poetry, I don't think it did actually. Emmett, I haven't been able to find anything that would indicate that their poetry reflected these political differences between those who came from a Republican background and those who came from a Communist Party background. But it's certainly true that, for instance, O'Donnell spent an awful lot of his book trying to draw the parallels between Spain and Ireland, both in terms of the two very rural societies having to fight against imperialism, and in, you know, the role of the church. He also, I think, of all of the writers, was perhaps the softest on the church, because I think he understood, coming from rural Ireland, just how powerful it was, and it wasn't something you wanted to make to have to fight over with the church. So to answer you, yes, there were different currents among them. As far as I know, none of the Irish writers were influenced by the current and someone had written up a question that Orwell was involved with the POUM and the anarcho socialists. As far as I know, Orwell didn't interact with any of the writers that I've been talking about, and certainly didn't influence them in any way. I mean, Orwell didn't really make an impression in a literary sense until after he returned to England and published his book, Homage to Catalonia. I don't know if Emmett, you want to add anything to that, if you have any thoughts.
Okay, then if Emmett isn't going to come in, I can just see here Anne Hart has her hand up, so I'm going to hit for Anne to unmute and she can ask her own question if that's okay, and then I'll come back to the messages in the chat box.
Oh, hello, and can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I have an interest in John Cornford. A number of years ago, Garrow led us to the battlefield where he died, and it was a most poignant visit. And I'm wondering how well regarded or how remembered he is by the British left.
Well, Cornford is a very interesting character. He really almost single-handedly in the 1930s began to develop a Marxist aesthetic in terms of poetry and writing. He also wrote on science. He wrote an extensive piece on George Bernard Shaw. So he was an intellectual as well as a poet. He went out of fashion then in the 50s and 60s for some reason. But recently, particularly in terms of both his philosophy and in terms of his literary criticism, Cornford has been looked at again by a whole number of people, and it's certainly coming back, not quite into fashion, but he's certainly, his books are deserving the credit that they deserve. I think he shared, in many ways, he would have been the British equivalent of Charlie Donnelly, who was very deep thinking about this relationship between politics and literature, who wasn't prepared to accept a sort of like crude propagandistic poetry. And I said, I'm not trying to dismiss that. That was written for a political purpose. But what Cornford was trying to do in a way in Britain, as I tried to explain what Donnelly was doing in terms of Irish poetry, was bridge the division between the personal and the political, not reject the classic aesthetic tradition that had, come down from Shelley and Marx and Lunacharsky and people like that in the past.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I can just see, I'll come back to, I can see a message here saying there are other questions as well, which I can't see anymore. So if people are putting questions and they don't come up, maybe send them again. I can't see any questions above these ones I've asked. Here's one, Paul, I don't know whether you can see it. My pronunciation is terrible. Not Irish related, but is there much info on the politics of Miguel de Unánimo, Basque writer and head of Salamanca University? Seems to have been critical of Franco, but not necessarily supportive of Republican forces.
I'm afraid I can't shed any real light on that. other than hearing about him, I really don't know a great deal about his work. So I wouldn't like to comment on something that I don't know about. Sorry about that.
Okay, Paul, if there's anybody out there, I know some of the Spanish comrades are on here. So if anybody has any further information on that and wants to jump in, you're more than welcome to answer the question.
There's a question here. Joe, there's a question here on the chat about the downing of Franco statues recently. I mean, it was my understanding that the last major statue to Franco was pulled down very recently. I mean, this fits in with the argument that's going on about in England and America about the Confederate statues and the slave owner statues that populate half the towns of Britain. I have no problem with them taking down those sort of statues. I really don't see that that it creates a intellectual or a aesthetic problem. Should they be destroyed, or should they be kept in a museum and put so that the context of them can be explained, so that future generations can see in the context of history and politics the statues and why they were there. And I'm not just talking about Franco, I'm talking about all the others. That is an interesting debate that's actually taking place. So I have an open mind on this, whether they should be destroyed or whether they should go into museums where the context, where they can be contextualized and people can understand why they were put up and what the background and why they were taken down.
Okay, there's I see Garrod has his hand up, but before we come to Garrod, there's another question you might see in the chat from Emmett O'Connor, which is Leslie Daiken was very critical of the modernists, especially Sean of Whalon. How was Daiken regarded by other writers?
At the time, Daiken, certainly within the left-wing milieu, Daiken was highly regarded. There's no doubt about it. I mean, his book, Goodbye to the Celtic, what was it called? Oh God, I've forgotten now. The Celtic Twilight book, in which he was trying to make a break with the old Yeatsian literary revival, romantic Ireland, you know, looking back to the past as a way of, you know, that Ireland, you know, the land of Ferdy and Cuchulainn and all the rest of it. He wanted a much more down to earth. And undoubtedly, in my mind, that book was influenced by Soviet literary policy, you know, the socialist realism, that what you really need to do was get your hands dirty and write about workers, give expression to the reality of the lives of workers and small farmers, etc. He was very critical of modernism, that it had, that people just had gone off on a tangent. It was inward looking. They were only concerned with personal feelings and emotions and had no feelings for the broader humanity. And that was a current that was very popular in the 1930s. As for all the reasons I talked about, this was a time of crisis when you were asked to make choices. You know, people genuinely, you know, did feel that the choice was barbarism or socialism. And so Daiken has to be seen in that context. Today, I don't believe Daiken is considered really, other than in a historical context. I don't think his work has a great deal of appeal to many people today.
Okay, I'm just going to click on Garrod now to unmute. He has his hand up to ask a question.
Yeah.
There's two Garrods on my screen.
Hi, apologies for that. I was in two different media and I bother coming through. Paul, Gurmila Magat, Hatchin and Karala Hagamorium. I really enjoyed the presentation. Paul, you said in passing, you referred to Jim Larkin's opposition to recruitment for the Spanish cause. Could you context? I mean, a lot of people maybe are slightly taken aback by the level of antagonism he showed towards people who were going to Spain. Could you contextualize that a little bit for those who are not familiar with the background to that, please?
Yeah, I'll say a few words about it. Obviously, Emmett O'Connor is the man to talk about that. Look, by the 1930s, Larkin was, in my opinion, you know, he was a Prometheus whose fire had gone out. He'd abandoned the Irish Workers' League, or the Irish Worker League. He was moving towards the Labour Party, and he was really, I think by this stage he was a shadow of the man that he was. I mean, when Larkin met Sean O'Casey, I think it was 1942, O'Casey was really taken back by how much Larkin had moved to, well, to the centre, if you like. He never moved to the right. How influenced he was, how much credibility he gave to the church, for instance. He'd ordered his son, young Jim Larkin, to attend a sort of a religious demonstration that was taking place, and carrying the, or I think it was actually it was a mass, sorry, a mass for dead workers. And his son was asked to represent, who was an atheist, to represent the union there. So I think by 1936, 1937, Jim Larkin was, in the issue of Spain, he sat on the fence, really. And what he asked, he ordered, I think that maybe that's not too strong a word, but it's, as my understanding is, that he ordered the officials not to speak on any platform in support of the Republican cause. And I suspect, though I don't know what his inner feelings was, maybe Emmett knows a bit more than me, is that he was looking over his shoulder at church criticism, was afraid that it would damage the union, the Workers' Union of Ireland. So, you know, I mean, Larkin is one of the most complex characters that we have in our history. In my opinion, a wonderful man, but a wonderful man who had failings as well. And I think this was a major failing. And that was the reason, as I said, Jack Carney resigned from the union over that. He wasn't prepared to be silenced on the issue of Spain. And he went to London and got involved in journalism.
I have a question for you, Paul. First of all, just talking about Larkin and the church. Some people may have seen it. The Dublin Dock Workers Preservation Society, which myself and Katrina are also involved with, collects memorabilia from the docklands and from the years of the dock workers. But one of the items in the collection, and every time it goes on display, gets huge interest, is a framed portrait of Archbishop McQuaid. That portrait of Archbishop McQuaid was in the headquarters of the Marine Port and General Workers Union. When the union were looking for a new head, there was a fear that they would get it off a socialist group, that they'd be influenced by Reds. So Archbishop McQuaid, as the story goes, basically gave them headquarters on the condition that his portrait always hung in their office, in the boardroom, over their meetings. So the influence of the church on the union, it was a big deal for the church to influence the unions, that they didn't have a mind of their own, but it certainly worked. And I just saw Emmett O'Connor reply there, but my question was, there's a great piece in Dominic Behan's autobiography where he talks about being a schoolboy. And while he was in school, the Christian Brothers asked to do a collection for Franco. So Dominic collects money, and when he's asked where it is, he says, "Oh, I gave it to the man." And the priest says, "What man?" And it turns out he'd given it to the Republicans in Dublin. He'd given it to the Spanish aid collection. I was just wondering, and we know Brendan tried to go to Spain and was too young to go. Did Brendan ever write on the topic of Spain, other than the quips he made? Did he ever include it in any of his works?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, well, the answer I can give you, I think it's the same one that you have. I don't know anything more than you've said. I mean, the Marine Port is interesting in, you know, the sense it was the dockers who also campaigned to have that huge statue put down at the end of, is it the Bull, what wall is it? The Bull Wall?
Bull Wall, yeah.
At the end of the Bull Wall. They were very involved. They were very influenced by the church and by the Milltown Institute, the Jesuits who'd sort of set up an alternative to workers' university or workers' school to train shop stewards in good church-led ideas that were not influenced by the Communist Party or indeed even by the Labour Party or the Republicans. So that seems to tie in with what you said.
And Emma O'Connor came in again on Kearney and Larkin.
Yeah, I saw that. Oh yeah, sorry there. I mean, that's an interesting point. That he, look, I don't like Emmett's one of the experts on this, but my reading of it was, you know, it wasn't just about pushing Kearney out. That there was a wider conservative element to it. I mean, it's very interesting. There's one of the letters between Jack Kearney and Sean O'Casey in 1947, after the death and funeral of Larkin. O'Casey writes that how he hated to see the way that Jim Larkin bent the knee to Archbishop McQuaid and the way the church horned in on his funeral. So certainly Kearney and O'Casey were extremely critical of the maybe benign influence, but sorry, influence in the background that the church was having on Larkin. I suspect he was keeping his head down. He wasn't prepared to stand up to the church, terrified of what effect it might have on the Union. But Emmett may very well be right that when Larkin decided you were gone, he took whatever measures were necessary to get rid of you. And it may have been a way of pushing Jack Kearney out of the WUI.
We don't see any other hands up, so if people have any questions, will they either post them into the chat now or put their hands up on the screen before we wrap up if there's nothing else?
I'm just going down the Daiken, yeah. Can I just where is it?
When you're ready, Paul, I see Manus has his hand up for a question, okay?
Yeah, is there a question coming up?
Yeah, do you want to go with that first?
Where is it?
It's Manus O'Riordan. It's he's going to talk.
Oh yeah, yeah. Is he going? Oh yeah, allow him in. Yeah.
Manus, you'll have to unmute yourself.
I've requested it there, but he hasn't.
Sorry, Manus, you'll have to.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, can you get back to Zoom? Just no, I don't want my.
Yeah, we can hear you. Okay, Manus.
Yeah, but I want to close. Yes, just a comment on O'Casey and Larkin and Kearney. I think what Larkin was doing was indeed protecting the Union, given the strength of the church, and that was his overriding objective there. But he also had a sort of an ambivalent relationship with Frank Ryan, because when Frank Ryan, having been wounded, stood for local elections here in Dublin, and they were about to speak in the same spot. I think it might have been the Five Lamps, and Larkin was up on the platform, and he says, "I'm going to let Frank Ryan go first, a brave man." So, and then in the Dáil, of course, he campaigned for Frank Ryan's release when he was a TD in 1943, and was attacked for that by a Cork Labour TD by the name of Richard Anthony. So that was Larkin and Frank Ryan. As for O'Casey on Frank Ryan, there's often a caricature of the Plough and the Star riots, where it was all down to the people who were protesting about there being prostitutes in Ireland. The actual highly political objection to the Plough and the Stars came from militant Republicans like Sheehy Skeffington and Frank Ryan himself. And Frank Ryan was one of the leaders of the riot in the Abbey Theatre. So O'Casey, of course, being very supportive of the Spanish Republic when again, around the same time that Ryan had been for local elections in Dublin, he also stayed for a while recuperating from his wounds with Sean O'Casey down in Devon. And this is an apocryphal story, but I think it's an authentic apocryphal story, because my father got it from John Nolan or Johnny Nolan, the Communist Party bookshop owner and manager, and who was editing one of the pro-Spanish Republican papers at the time, and therefore worked closely with Ryan, and Ryan would have been with Johnny Nolan when he came back in that period as well. So I think this is a true story that my father got from Johnny Nolan, and Johnny Nolan got directly from Ryan himself. But during the period of recuperation, and in Devon, O'Casey decided to broach the question of the Plough and the Star riots, and he sort of very gently said to Frank, "Tell me, Frank, why did you do it?" And Frank replied to O'Casey, "Tell me, Sean, why did you write the bloody play?" So they never made up on that issue.
Yeah, I haven't. Can I go back in? I haven't heard that story, but it sounds pretty par for the course. But it's also interesting. I think I'm not sure if it's in some of the letters, or it may even be in Eileen O'Casey's biography called Sean. She describes Ryan and two of his comrades coming to stay with O'Casey that couple of days, and they stayed 2 or 3 days that Manus talked about. And she describes Sean O'Casey imploring Ryan not to go back to Spain, and not to go back to Spain for 2 reasons: that he needed time to recuperate from his wounds, and secondly, Sean argued that he was needed in Ireland politically needed in Ireland. And I can't remember the exact thing that Ryan said, but O'Casey records him as saying, I can't do that, Sean. I owe it to my comrades to be out there with them. And O'Casey, in that description that of the meeting between O'Casey and Ryan, you can see very clearly from it, the way O'Casey speaks and Eileen records the incident, that this was a very enjoyable meeting, a meeting of minds between two people, that the events over the Plough and the Stars were put behind them. O'Casey even describes Ryan, he says, as a fine man. And he even says that as a young man, he played hurling with Ryan up in the park at some stage or other. Quite clearly, from the outbreak of the Civil War in Spain, O'Casey was very concerned about the events, followed it very closely, and whenever he was asked, offered support in any way that he could for either fundraising or political support in the terms of articles or otherwise to support the Republican cause in Spain.
Paul, I don't see any more questions. There's
That's
plenty
fine.
of messages thanking you for the great presentation and for
Okay.
the work. So
Can
I
I
share that message. So if you want to wrap up.
only a minute or two. You know, look, you said you're recorded the meeting, and if people are interested, I mean, obviously in terms of the slideshow, there are many things we just ran through, or the PowerPoint presentation. And if, Joe, if it's possible, I can add references to where those can actually be found. And one of the problems we face is that much of the literary analysis, as opposed to the historical analysis, is contained in the academic press and journals. And I will try to put together a list of the citations for those as well. So those who want to pursue the literary aspect of the Spanish Civil War further, at least can know where to go and find it. I didn't go into it because of a lack of time, etc. But also worth mentioning is the book is by Maren Mitchell. I spoke about the Ireland Today special issue, the Symposium on Spain, and she made a contribution to it, which is quite interesting. And she was a woman journalist who went out to Spain in, I think it was 1935. And she wrote a book called Storm Over Spain, which was published in 1937, the same year as Peadar O'Donnell's book. And it's not really a literary or a political book. It's about her trip around Spain in the months leading up to the Civil War. But she does at times get the flavor of this sort of great crisis that is looming. And it's not a book that up to a short while ago that I was familiar with. And it's one that's actually rarely referenced in the literature. So thank you for all the great questions and all the rest of it, and good night.
Okay, I think I think we just wrap up now then. Katrina, I think you want me to do the wrap up?
Yeah.
Okay, Paul, look, on behalf of East Wall History Group and Friends of the International Brigades Ireland, just want to thank you for a brilliant talk. You know the material, I think, better than anyone, and you put it across so well. So much appreciated, and we'll definitely follow you up for more work. You won't get away with that, I have to say. Never offer to do anything because you will be asked. But thanks, Paul, and hopefully when things are improved, we might have a live session similar to this. So just to wrap up, I just want to thank everybody for attending. As Garrod said earlier, normally this time of year, many of us would have been over at the Harama Walk. This coming weekend would have been the Charlie Donnelly Winter School. We would have been at that meeting people. But one of the advantages of having events like this on Zoom is the participation we have. And I'm just looking through the list. Last week, there was a virtual commemoration from Paracon that Maximo held, which was excellent to be able to attend. But looking at the list here, there's people obviously from Ireland, from the United Kingdom. I see Pamela is on from Canada. Nancy's on from the United States. Maximo and others are on from Spain. And there's people I've no idea where they are. So it's great in the spirit of international that we're talking about, that we can all be here under the circumstances. So just on that, I think that we just wrap up, and then hopefully in the coming year we can start seeing each other physically again and commemorate the heroes of the International Brigades and those who fought for the Spanish Republic. So on that, I think just say good night, and thanks to Paul and to everybody for taking part.